Hey folks, Sam Luce here with iZotope. Thanks for checking out part 2 of our in-depth video series where we're listening to compression, not just applying settings that we think should work. If we're listening to the effect a control has on a sound source, we can make a much better decision about how we should set it. First off, we took a look at vocals. Check it out up here if you've not already seen it. This time we're focusing on drums. Now, compressing drums is largely the opposite of compressing a vocal. Previously we saw how it was all about leveling out a take throughout the duration of a song. With drums, we're sometimes approaching it with that mindset, but sometimes we're looking at it in terms of fattening up a source. I'm going to keep coming back to this point. The reason I want to compress drums in the context of this track is because everything feels kind of separate and I want to make it sound like one instrument. In a moment, we're going to go across to a different session that has some different issues that I'm going to deal with. So 2 different ways of approaching compressing a drum kit. The first on a bus level to add some more life, a bit more vibe. The second is compressing the bus to achieve a slightly different result, but also going in on a micro level and compressing individual drums. First off, let's take a listen to the track and work out why we want to use compression in the first place. This is a really vibey track. It's got that halftime shuffle groove. The drums are giving me a kind of Led Zeppelin feel, and to me it's screaming out for a bit more sustain and a bit more room. So this is 100% genre specific. I'm going to move on to something that's a totally different genre in a moment, but one key thing that we can do with compression is add some life to a drum kit, and that's exactly what I'm going to do here. Often when you see videos on compressing drums, you'll dive straight in and start slamming down the snare drum or a kick drum. That's not the approach I want to take here. I want to take a look at the entire kit and how one compressor can really shape not only the transients of the drums, but the overall feel of the kit. And then when you bring in another compressor, you can achieve something totally different. Let's check it out. So I've actually got 2 compressors on here. I'm going to go through them in series and work out exactly what's going on. 2 vastly different sounds, and the second is actually more of a parallel compressor, but we'll get onto that in a moment. So first off, we've got the attack at 40 milliseconds, thereabouts, ratio at around 4:1, and the release of around 103 milliseconds. So what I want to do is just bring this threshold down. These settings are tuned to what I kind of feel is working, and you'll hear that as I bring the threshold down, we're not annihilating transients. We're not completely killing everything because the attack is still allowing some to come through, but we're going to tweak that and see how it sounds. The release is tuned so that it's letting the room punch through after it's compressed. So 2 things to listen for here. First of all is transients. And second of all is that period after the transient where it comes back up to no compression happening after the release has taken place. Let's bring that threshold down, see what we're dealing with. Okay, so I've got auto gain on here, so I'm not having to turn anything up. Hopefully we're getting a more or less like for like input for output. What I'm noticing here is that as I bring the threshold down to around the level it's at the moment, this is kind of a sweet spot for me. It's bringing up the room fairly considerably, as you heard when I did the A/B comparison. When I bring the threshold down any further than that, we're adding some real smack to the transients. And that's because in relative terms, we're kind of turning the transient up. Because of the attack time being where it is, we're letting that initial transient come through before it starts compressing fully. This is really important because this is a great way to add snap to drums. It's all about this attack time. The sustain is going to be governed by the release control. That's that room. That's how much it comes back up afterwards. When we're listening to a compressor, we need to think about it in terms of what it's compressing, but then also what it's not compressing. So the time before it gets to the full attack and the time after it releases. As I bring this threshold down, we're getting a real snap on those transients and we're getting loads more room come up. But then as I kind of level that out to this around 26.2, 25-ish, minus 25 dB, we're getting a nice balance between the room coming up and the transients kind of being tucked in slightly. Let's just take a listen to that again. As I bring the threshold down, just hear the point at which the room comes up and the transients start being shaped a little bit. Hear how when I bypass the compressor, all that room, all that sustain goes away. And that is governed by this release. If I bring that release control up, it's not going to release fast enough. So it's still going to be compressing on that room kind of section. So we're not going to hear that. So let's bring the release up and we're going to hear that room kind of go away a little bit. As I bring that release down to around 150, we're getting the effect of that. So it's releasing and it's allowing the non-compressed state to kind of re-emerge, and that's the room. It's clamping down the initial transient and then the room is coming back into play. If we bring that down too much, let's take a listen to what happens. We kind of lose a little bit of the character. We're releasing too quickly. We're bringing that transient down and then saying, all right, pretty much straight away, just come back to normal. So we're losing that release characteristic where the room actually comes into play. So too long a release and you're not going to get that room coming into play soon enough. Too fast a release and it's just coming straight back in, and it's barely as if it ever went away. But by tuning that release, and the tempo of the song is going to kind of be relevant here as well, by tuning that release so that it's coming up, it's kind of coming up rhythmically and it's making it so the room appears and really comes into the sound. I'm going to keep the ratio kind of where it is for 4:1. If I do bring that down, then just briefly, you're going to notice that, as you would expect, we're going to get less of a compression sound. We're going to be reining in those transients less. And if we bring the ratio up, then we're going to be compressing more. You'll hear that as I bring that ratio down, we're getting less kind of smack. And as I bring it up, we're perhaps going to be getting a little bit too much smack. And it's kind of in that limiting territory. I feel like 4:1 is kind of a sweet spot here. Too much lower than that and we weren't really doing what we're setting out to achieve, and too much more, there's too much snap, there's too much attack on that transient. But The attack is going to be very important. If I bring this attack all the way down, then we're not going to hear the initial transient coming through. So we're essentially going to be knocking off too much of the percussive element of this, but having it too long and we're not allowing the transient just to come through, we're allowing too much of it to come through. So the reason you get that snap on a drum kit when you apply compression is because a small portion of that transient is allowed to come through. If we allow the whole hit to come through, it's as if we're not compressing. So let's bring it all the way down and then start to bring it up and hear where we start to hear that transient. Somewhere around this 30 point, 20 to 30, the snare starts to come alive. If I bring that down to maybe 15-ish, you're going to hear the snare is really set back. But as I just start to bring that up, we're allowing it to poke through. Nice. And this is an effect. This is a real roomy kind of thing. This is not subtle compression. We're really going for it here. If I bring the attack up too much, though, we're not going to be compressing those transients enough, and we're not going to get that dynamic reduction. So let's just bring that up. Let's bring it up all the way. Let's go for 500 milliseconds and start to bring that down and hear when that compression starts to take place. Yeah, so we're getting the initial transient coming through even at attack of 65. And with that release where it is, we're then allowing the whole room to kind of come back in and suck up back through. So that's the first one that I've got on there. I've got a kind of a real effect compressor on here as well. If I bring in number 2, this is in parallel, I should say, to start off with. So I've got the mix at 59%. If I just bring this all the way down, and then I'm going to start bringing it up, and you're going to hear what's going on. Now, if you just take a look at the settings, the release is in this similar ballpark to this one, because that the room sound coming through, that's kind of where I want it. But the attack is far quicker, and the ratio is far higher. So as you'd expect, this is going to be knocking off some transients. But because I'm bringing it in parallel, we're only bringing in a little bit of that sound, or kind of 50-50, half of that sound. As I bring it up, just hear how everything just gets way vibier and everything kind of gets a little more smushy, but in a great way. So let's bring this up. This one is really about vibe. I've maybe gone a little bit overboard there. I could probably bring that down just a touch, maybe to like 40%. And this is just about getting the overall room sound in there, knocking off the transients a touch, but just getting some life in there. Now, we've been doing what we always tell people we shouldn't do, and that's isolating the instrument when we're compressing, but it's just so we can kind of hear stuff. We're going to bring it back into the mix now. I'm going to take both compressors off by bypassing this entire instance of Neutron, and even when we've got everything else in there, you're going to hear the room just come up, and the whole thing is just going to come to life a little bit. all just becomes a little more real, and those ghost notes come up significantly on the snare drum. The whole thing just feels a little more cohesive, and everything is just in one room, and vibe is just the word I'd use to describe that. It's still got loads of punch, but the room is coming through, it's kind of whooshing up, and that pumping that's usually kind of thought of as a bad thing is really helping us here. Let's move on to the second session though, because we've got another drum kit that is a completely different style, and it's got some very different issues with it. So in this session, we're going to be working on two separate things. Firstly, we're going to go for the drum bus, and then we're going to go for the snare as well. I just want to bring this compressor out and in again, and just so you can hear what's going on a drum bus level. And then we'll discuss that, and we'll discuss how it's different from the previous example, and then we'll take a look at the actual snare drum compression. This time we're talking about just knocking off transients and fattening. We're not really as concerned about bringing the room up. We're concerned about the other side of the equation and bringing the transients down. So let's take a listen to it in the mix, and then we'll listen to it soloed, and you'll be able to hear exactly what it's doing. So first off, we're going to go with no compression, then I'll bring it in.
I saw a photograph printed in black and white of a face that followed a path filled with crinkles and wrinkles of heavy days, lovely nights, and that's all.
So fairly conservative settings, but we're bringing a bit more weight to the drums, and we're bringing a little bit more weight, I think is the word, and we're just chopping off those transients a touch. But I've also got the compressor on the snare, which I'm going to bring that in now as well, and you'll hear the difference. So I'm just going to bring this snare compressor on and off, start with it off, and you'll hear what's going on.
I saw a photograph printed in black and white of a face that followed a path filled with crinkles and wrinkles of heavy days, lovely nights, and that's why.
Really dealing with the weight here. Let's just solo the drum bus for a moment and get on that version of Neutron for the drums. We've gone through in the previous example exactly what these controls are going to be doing and how we can release some of the room and how we can knock off some of the transients. So let's just turn some knobs and just see what we can get. So the attack at the moment is at 115.9. Let's bring that down and just hear how it's going to be kind of detrimental if we bring it down too much, because we're trying to add some weight, so we actually want most of the transient to come through. Here there is just completely destroying the transient. We're maybe giving it a little more weight in relative terms, but not the kind of weight we want. It's too smashy and it doesn't actually let the transient come through enough. But as we bring that up, we're allowing it to pass through unaffected or mostly unaffected. We can really hear it on the kick and on the snare as well. The release, in my opinion, on a track like this, where we're not dealing with necessarily bringing up the room, is less important than it is where we're dealing with the room sound. We're trying to bring up some of the sustain. So if we have this release too long, then it's going to be releasing after another hit has happened, especially in a drum part like this, where it's quite fast paced. If we're having the release too long, then it's not going to release in time, and we're going to be still compressing when the next snare hit happens. So just take a listen to that. If I bring this release up too much, the compression is just going to get a little bit too much and it's not going to come back. We're not going to be shaving off the transients in the same way. We're going to be doing more of a kind of a leveling overall thing, which is not really what we want. As I bring that release back down to around the 120 point, we start to regain some of that weight. If it's up too high, then we lose some of that weight. If we bring it down, we get a little bit more. So listen to that one more time. I'll bring it right up and you'll hear the weight kind of goes away. As I bring it back down towards the 120, 130 kind of region, a bit more of the weight comes back in. Nice. And in this instance, Having it on 120 milliseconds is medium, maybe medium short. If we bring it any shorter, the difference, because we are just shaving off transients, is not going to be as noticeable as it was when we were dealing with the sustain of the drums. Because we're just dealing with transients, just bringing down those real peaks. Also, because we're not dealing with taking down too much of the transient, as we have the ratio at 4:1, as I have for a lot of these videos, we're not going to be doing too much. If we bring down the threshold and then bring the ratio down, then we're going to be just gently kind of hugging the sound. It's going to be less about the actual transient control and more about overall compression. But as we bring this threshold down, we're going to be compressing more. So just here, as I bring this down, there is a sweet spot where we're compressing too much or compressing not enough. So you can hear there, it's really slamming down on stuff. And in that instance, the release is going to be a little more useful. We're going to need to bring that release down because, as you can see from the trace, it's not being released before the next hit because there's so much compression happening. And that's kind of an example of overcompression. That's really slamming down on stuff needlessly. If I bring the threshold back up to kind of around about where it was and then bring that ratio up, then we're going to be achieving a little more compression, perhaps not quite as noticeably, but on the louder snare hits, we're going to get a little more smack, a little more slam. And you'll hear that ratio, as I bring it down to basically something that begins with a 4 point something, we just get the weight back. And anything above that is just clamping down a little bit too much. And because we're compressing a decent amount when we bring that ratio up, the attack comes into play as well. So we'll perhaps need to alter that attack time if we've got a higher release. We'll perhaps need to lengthen that attack time a little bit because raising the ratio is going to be compressing more. So we need to let the transient or more of the transient kind of come through. I think this is a great example of just leveling stuff out. We're not as concerned about the overall sustain of the kit as we were in the previous example. We're more worried about knocking off transients and just making things a little bit more leveled. Now, let's go to the snare drum because I've actually had that compressor on for the duration, but just take a listen. When I take that off, we actually just get a far more empty sound, and it's just not really as weighty, as chunky as it is when the compressor's engaged. And that's the kind of thing that you will hear when the whole mix is there. If I bring this compressor off, you're just going to hear the snare just come up a little bit in the low end and just punch through a little bit more when the compressor's engaged.
I saw a photograph printed in black and white of a face that followed a path filled with crinkles and wrinkles of heavy days, lovely nights, and that's why I gotta run some.
And if I just solo this snare out for a second, we're going to hear in the same way as we have in the last two examples, the same thing is true. If I bring this attack down, then we're going to be reining in that transient a little bit too much. All the weight goes away. And as I said, because we're dealing with just nipping off those transients a touch, the release is not as important. It's still important in that if we have it too long, it's going to be detrimental. But anything in the kind of faster to mid-fast kind of range is going to work as long as it's not overlapping, as long as we've not got it still releasing when another snare hit takes place. You see there, it's taking away from that next snare hit because the release is too long. As I bring that down, especially on those double snares, as the release comes down, we're going to notice that the punch comes through a little bit more on that second hit. And that's what it's about for the release, timing it so that it doesn't become detrimental to the sound, timing it so that it's not still compressing or still releasing when another hit takes place. Hopefully that's given you a bit more of an insight into how we can deal with compression on drums and how these different controls are actually interacting with each other. The attack and release are so important with transient rich material like a drum kit. Attack too fast and we're going to be chopping off those transients, but attack too slow, we're not chopping off enough. The release is really important when we're dealing with a drum bus kind of level stuff and we want all that sustain to come up. So whether we're dealing with it on a bus level or an individual track level, we can apply these techniques to different drums, different genres, different specific instruments that are going to react in the same way as these. What we've learned there for the snare is going to be applicable to a kick drum or to a tom. And what we've kind of learned for that drum bus stuff is going to be applicable to overheads and room mics as well. Next up, we're going to be dealing with guitars and bass and how we have to approach them very differently because of the vastly different frequency content and how they both play a slightly different role in a mix. I'll see you in that one. Take care.